You're watching BNN Bloomberg. I'm John Ehrlichman, and we continue to watch the energy turmoil play out right in front of us here. We started yesterday with that historic crash and negative prices, the expiring WTI contract for May, spending time in negative territory, and then in the last hour or so, U.S. President Donald Trump pledging to support the U.S. players. Let's get some more Canadian perspective on what's going on in the world of oil. Hal Kvisle is the chair of the Business Council of Alberta and the former CEO of TransCanada, and one of our regular guests on the subject of energy. Hal, thanks very much. I mean, it's been a pretty wild series of events over the last 24 hours. What's been your reaction?
I think, first of all, John, we need to think about the expiry of the May contract as a unique event that as you get into those final hours of trading on any one of the monthly contracts, all kinds of illiquidity can come into it. If holders of long contracts for crude oil don't shed those contracts before the end of that day, they're going to have to take physical delivery, and that's just not something they can do. So there's often a scramble as a contract comes to the end of its term. And that's what really happened yesterday. What's much more interesting, I think, right now is to watch the June contract and where the June contract goes. And I noticed on your show just a few minutes ago, one trader predicting that the June contract could go to zero, below zero, or close to zero. And that's what we have to watch, because right now, globally, we're producing maybe 25 billion barrels a day more than is being consumed, and that creates a severe imbalance. And no individual producer feels the pressure to cut back that the whole market should be feeling. And it's just one of those situations where individual decisions don't add up to the right thing for the whole market.
And so I know I'm putting you in a tough spot to try to predict where things go when we really don't know what's going to happen with COVID-19, and when we can see some kind of return to business and then the demand story for oil changes. But if you were running a company today and you were trying to figure out how you're going to position the business for some kind of recovery, I mean, any sense on when the industry could start talking about at least some kind of rebound off these very challenging lows that we're seeing right now?
John, I think there's three factors. First of all, we've seen the 10 million barrel a day cutback by the OPEC Plus group. And that was important because OPEC Plus had gone way out on a limb, and they were actually ramping up production, completely ignoring the decline in demand due to COVID. So to see that 10 million barrels a day come off on the production side is positive. But then the second big issue is, how long is the COVID demand destruction going to last? When is demand going to come back? OPEC Plus may be down 10 million barrels a day, but demand is down roughly 25 million barrels a day. And that's going to take a while. So I think you can assume at least 6 months before that demand turns itself around. And then the third really important factor is the amount of oil that is in storage today. We have storage tanks near record highs. All the strategic petroleum reserves in the U.S. and elsewhere are near full. And as long as that storage is full and people are naturally going to want to draw it down, that adds yet another stream of oil coming into the market. My own view, I think, if we can get through the year 2020 without significant bankruptcies or other kinds of troubles at our Canadian oil-producing companies, we'll be fortunate. I think there are going to be some bankruptcies, but the main thing is to get through 2020, and I think once we get into 2021, we'll see market forces come back. One last point I'd add to that is that decline rates today, at least in North America, are steeper than they were back in the 80s and 90s, the last time we went through this sort of a crisis. And with that steeper decline rate in the shale plays, that will help bring the market back into balance. But we're talking about maybe 2 or 3 million barrels a day of decline, not the 50 or 20 million barrels that's needed to bring the market into balance.
Since you talked about bankruptcies, I just want to get your sense on the kinds of things that could help companies skirt bankruptcy. We've already talked today about additional production being shut down as a likely path on one hand. But we also talk a lot about government aid, government assistance. We've covered some of the steps the federal government has laid out to provide assistance. There are clearly some who would like to see much more done. What is the best way to keep these companies alive during this troubling year?
John, I think a lot of it just comes down to liquidity and whether or not companies have cash on the balance sheet and the ability to fund ongoing work that they need to do to keep people employed, to do critical work that keeps a company alive. And I'm very encouraged that the federal government came out with the abandoned well program. That was a big positive to keep the service sector going. That doesn't do much for the producing companies, but it certainly helps the service companies here in Western Canada. They've come out with some credit assistance for small to mid-size oil companies up to a certain size. But I think what's really needed most is financing or a credit guarantee backstop arrangement from the Government of Canada that would enable the Canadian banks and other financial institutions to extend more credit to the larger producers here. It's one thing when a number of small producers go under, but if some of Canada's largest oil and gas companies run into difficulty, even though their assets are far more than their debts, they just don't have the liquidity. They don't have the cash flow on a week-to-week, month-to-month basis. That's where I think the Government of Canada needs to do a little more work and think a little bit more about what kind of credit support program they could provide to these companies, because if they start to go down, this is reminiscent of 1986 when I was a Dome Petroleum guy, and Dome ran into severe difficulty that could have endangered the whole industry here in Western Canada. And fortunately, with help from the federal government, we were able to get through that and sell the company. Some of those kinds of things are going to happen again this time around.
Hal, we're almost out of time, but I just want to clarify. I mean, when we're talking about that possibility of bankruptcies, what comes to mind are, to your point, some of the maybe smaller players that might have more troubles on their balance sheet. But could we be in a scenario here where we're talking about some of the biggest energy companies in this country possibly being in a position where if they don't get the credit they need, that they would go bankrupt?
Bankruptcy is a difficult term. It usually means that your debts exceed your assets, and I don't see that happening for any of the large companies in Canada. The bigger issue is more just the liquidity crisis, and I'm pretty sure that at the 11th hour, the Canadian government would step up and provide liquidity support for those big companies. What's important now is that they think about doing that sooner. What can they do in the way of providing credit support that would preempt a company getting into that difficult circumstance? I think it's relatively straightforward. I think it's absolutely in the national interest, and I think the government should do it. John, I just want to mention one other thing, and that's that Canada's also got a very strong natural gas sector, in addition to our 5 million barrels a day of oil. And right now, the natural gas sector is relatively strong. Natural gas prices have not gone to zero. Companies are still generating good cash flows. Canada really needs to think about what can we do to make the most of our natural gas sector in these times, and I think there's a number of levers that can play there.
Okay. All good food for thought. Hal, thanks as always. Do appreciate your time. That's Hal Kvisle, the chair of the Business Council of Alberta and the former CEO of TransCanada, joining